Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. This will be the first of our Lyceum debates. The issue under discussion today is the abolition of private property both possible and feasible? In the affirmative is SnakeIsNinja, and in the negative is Mathoma. So, Snake, your 10 minutes begin now.
All right, well, first, I think it's essential to clearly define all the key terms we're going to be using during this debate, so we don't end up talking past one another about our own definitions of the terms in question. The topic of the debate is private property, so it's important that we are as accurate as possible when addressing what exactly that even is. Oftentimes, libertarians will describe private property as any kind of property other than public property. This is actually false, as it turns out. The true definition is far narrower than that. Believe it or not, the computer you're currently watching this debate on, for example, is not private property, nor are your speakers, headphones, or desk. All of these items are neither private property nor public property. There are other kinds of property than private and public, like common property, for example, which describes property shared by everyone, like the air you breathe. So then, if your computer is not private property, then what is it? Well, that's very simple. Your computer is your personal property. That's right, you can own property other than private property. In fact, I'm willing to bet that you don't own any private property at all. Most people don't. So what is private property? Well, the classic example would be a factory. A factory has an owner who not only derives a profit from the factory, but he does not operate the factory himself. He doesn't work there. He's probably never even set foot on the premises in his life. Yet because he is viewed as the rightful owner of the property, he will profit from the labor of the workers operating the factory. Another example would be a large plot of farmland used to produce crops. Again, in all likelihood, someone owns the farm, but he profits from it despite not actually operating it. In reality, it would be run entirely by hired workers. Now, it's important to note that there are situations in which a farm would actually be personal property. If you plant a garden in your backyard, for example, let's say you plant some tomatoes, you're not going to hire men to water them. You're going to do it yourself. You would both own the garden personally and use the garden yourself. Even if you derived a benefit from it, it still wouldn't be private property because this benefit would be from your own labor, not the exploitation of workers. You could grow tomatoes in your garden and eat them, or sell them at a local farmer's market, and the garden would still be your personal property. As you might imagine, very few individuals actually own any private property. You know, maybe George Soros owns private property, but most of us don't derive profits from our privately owned international chain of sweatshops. Most people go to their place of work and perform a service alongside coworkers to earn a living. Most of the people we interact with there, aside from customers, are workers like us. Even our boss or managers are fellow employees who work at the same location, overseeing the operations personally. We may never encounter the one who actually owns the office building we work at. Considering that the overwhelming majority of people don't own any private property whatsoever, I would argue that yes, it is feasible to abolish private property. Furthermore, this very discussion of property calls into question the entire way we think about ownership and how we act out these beliefs in our day-to-day life. You own many things like your cell phone, but what does that mean exactly? Well, it means you ultimately have authority over who may use your property. Well, what if someone ignores your authority? What if you leave your phone unattended in a public area and someone, seeing it, picks it up and takes it for themselves? Are they not the new owner? Well, they might claim to be, but I'd imagine you'd have something to say about that. As you can see, this authority is quickly called into question and is often a point of contention. Authority alone does not dictate ownership. If someone picks your pocket and escapes into the crowd before you can identify him, you can complain all you want, but the fact of the matter is that he is now the de facto owner of your wallet because whatever authority you claimed to have simply has no bearing on reality. Ultimately, while ownership may exist in theory, for it to mean anything, it must be observed in practice. In the case of your stolen phone, you can appeal to a higher authority, the state. If the thief continues to insist that you are lying and the phone is his rightful property, the matter shall be settled in a court of law, in which a state-appointed judge, who has authority over both you and the thief, shall review your claims and declare a verdict. Hopefully that your phone belongs to you. The ultimate conclusion, observed in reality, is what makes the property yours, not abstract theory. Now, if the judge decreed, for whatever reason, that the case against the thief wasn't strong enough to prove his guilt, then despite your assertions that you are indeed the rightful owner, in practice your claim of ownership would not be observed. Ultimately, while living in a territory governed by a state, the state is the final authority on all matters of ownership, as it is the state alone which grants its citizens permission to use property, or withholds that permission. And it is the state which sets parameters in which the property is to be used for the use to be considered legal. If the state determines that you possess property illegally, the state will enforce its authority by force. That is why the state has authority, and that is where you derive your authority as property owner from, the application of force. Ownership is seen in practice, not in theory, and in practice right now, the state has a myriad of rules, regulations, and outright bans on all sorts of property, from drugs to magazine clip sizes. The notion that once you acquire property and declare yourself the owner of said property, that now you have 100% authority over it and the freedom to use it in whatever way you see fit is completely absurd. This idea is simply not observed in practice. In practice, all property is ultimately property of the state when push comes to shove. It just so happens that the state may decide that you are allowed to possess a given piece of property, like a parent deciding that his child is allowed to possess a toy. It may be easy to think of the toy as belonging to the child. It's his action figure, but the relationship between the parent and child ultimately gives the parent authority to decide what the child is permitted to own, and thus all the child's property is his parent's property at the end of the day. In light of all this, it is completely feasible that one day a state might determine that no individual citizen may lawfully possess an international chain of 1,000 steel mills, generating billions of dollars off the labor of hired workers, which he collects despite never having so much as seen the facilities in person. It is perfectly feasible that the state, which enforces the property rights of business tycoons over their empires, might fail to enforce them, or choose not to enforce them. Or in a relevant court case, the judge might determine that despite the globalist billionaire's assertions that he is the rightful owner of 34 sweatshops in China, that his case is not strong enough to prove that the workers who are currently in possession of this facility are guilty of theft. Now, this may seem absurd, but so is copyright law. Declaring that common property like language, images, music, and even ideas can be someone's intellectual property. The state is fully capable of enforcing verdicts concerning property which might strike most of us as totally indefensible. While the complete and total abolition of all private property in a given geographical area may seem unlikely, it is by no means impossible. It's a simple matter to point at any one of the historical or modern states which have done exactly that, under some variation of socialism, from the USSR to Mao's China. But state-down socialism enforced by the iron will of a totalitarian regime is not the only means by which it would be feasible to abolish private property. We all know that if enough people view the current iteration of the state as illegitimate, then the state will collapse. The truth is, you cannot enforce private property without the state. Now, this may seem improbable, but it has happened before. In 1989, who would have believed that the Soviet Union would collapse simply because people stopped believing in it? Yet 2 years later, this is exactly what happened. This is also what happened with the Tsar and the French monarchy. There are a couple of ways this could go down, and I'll talk about them in more detail later, but I think that's good enough for now. If private property is not enforced, it is as good as abolished.
All right. Thank you, Snake. Your 10 minutes begin now, Mathoma.
Like Snake, I'd like to first of all clarify some of the terms under the discussion and also the significance of this discussion about private property and its abolition. Now, the role of private property has a special place for Marxists and socialists, which is why we're even talking about this sort of thing. As was already suggested, there is a theory within Marxism that the labor puts in some amount of labor into whatever it is that he produces. This is, of course, contingent upon the labor theory of value, but let's suppose the worker puts in some amount of labor. Now, the capitalist has to skim off the top and exploit the labor who does not get his fair share of what he put into this. This leads to the exploitation of the labor, which is why private property is so important to socialists and why it creates this hierarchy between the capitalist class and the labor. And it sets up a hierarchy in society in which the capitalist has a lot of things, and presumably unjustly, and the workers or the proletariat which have very little. I noticed we were also talking about this distinction between terms of private property and personal possessions, which is a distinction which is accepted within Marxist orthodoxy, but it's not really found very much elsewhere. We were saying that private property is anything owned by the individual. Furthermore, it's anything that's owned by the individual which another person or group could work on. And the person who owns this thing could conceivably make a profit. Now, personal possession is basically the above minus the profit motive, the potential to be used as profit. Marxists and socialists typically cite the example of a toothbrush. Presumably, you can't make a profit off of a toothbrush. It's a personal possession, but not private property. As I'll argue a bit later, I think this distinction is very tenuous, and you can't actually maintain this distinction a priori. And then, of course, we have the other two classes of property, which are public and collective property. Now, it seems to me that the goal of this proposal is to find a way to shift all of this private property from the class of private property into the remaining three classes, either personal possession, public property, or collective property. Another term that we should also talk about is what is feasible? What are we going to take to be a feasible proposal for how we're going to actually abolish private property in practice? And we've heard a lot about in practice and not so much in theory. So what is feasible? Now, to my mind, a feasible mechanism for abolishing private property would not require any of the following. It would not require chopping off heads in the style of the French Revolution, say. It does not require sending people to gulags and forcibly extracting labor, as was actually happened in the Soviet Union. It does not require a law which cannot conceivably be enforced and is merely a symbolic fixture. That is, if we implement a law, it has to actually be enforceable. Furthermore, the sort of system that we're trying to set up here, in contrast to what we currently have, should be stable. We're looking for a system which can perpetuate itself over time, and there's no intrinsic impetus for reverting back to the old system with private property. That is, the private property can be abolished indefinitely. Also, it should be roughly in accordance with the spirit of the nation. For example, in the United States, many policies today get instantly litmus tested to see whether the policy is much too socialistic or not. One easy example of this would be some of the policies under the Obama administration, such as the Affordable Care Act, which was, whether you agree or disagree, whether it's socialistic or not, it was decried as socialistic and Soviet reminiscent. Also, for the same reasons, these proposals should not stink of Soviet-style politics, because these policies seem to be outside the Overton window for Americans, and should not stink of Orwellian or totalitarian-style policies, for the same reason that's simply outside the Overton window and simply not going to be feasible. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the general features of any programs we might hear tonight for actually abolishing private property. The first would be the initiation of such a proposal or such a program, the initiation or the spark, the thing that gets it going. Secondly, we have the transition stage from the stage of having private property to the state of having no private property. And thirdly, the long-term maintenance and enforcement of this lack of private property. That is, it cannot be merely, we cannot simply transform from one state to another. We have to actually enforce this as well. There has to be some mechanism by which this is enforced. Now, there are a number of proposals I'd like to take care of in this opening statement, and we'll come back to some more convoluted ones later. The first sort of proposal one might propose on the socialistic side is, why not simply pass a law top-down banning private property? Now, this, of course, presupposes a number of different things. This presupposes that people could conceivably get elected either at the state or the federal level to pass such a law, Now, as it stands, such a law is totally outside the Overton window. As I said, we remember the fuss about the Affordable Care Act. Even that was much too socialistic for a country such as the United States. So let's just remember what sort of backlash we're going to get from abolishing private property. Also, once such people are elected, say congressmen and senators, these politicians have to actually follow through on their promises. As we know, politicians are continuously being lobbied and bribed by third parties. And, such a proposal to ban private property is not going to be copacetic with say, oil companies or Monsanto, who we know actually have influence upon American politics. Also, such a law has to somehow slide by the numerous subcommittees of our legislature. And certainly if any congressman actually stood up and proposed this law, proposed the bill to get sent through, it's going to get amended to oblivion. And this is because our government does not simply allow any radical changes like this. Our government runs at the speed of molasses. Also, such a law, if it were passed top down, has to somehow slide by the courts as well in the long term. Remember what I was saying about this mechanism has to be a long-term sort of thing as well. This law has to slide by the courts, has to be constitutional if we're going by the current system, and has to slide by the courts on both state and federal levels. And the tension between state and federal levels is another problem too. Suppose this gets passed federally first. This creates a significant tension between the central and the state governments. And the states might very well refuse to enforce such a law, such an abolition of private property. Now, problems with getting this passed to the state level first and not federally first would only add to the confusion. This is just multiplier problems trying to get this sort of thing passed at the state level times 50. I think what we would have to conclude here is that such a proposal is not feasible in the current system, which raises the question, how do we change the system? If this is feasible at all, it seems like the plausibility of abolishing private property is no greater than overthrowing the United States government. And that's really the key point I'd like to drive home in this opening statement, that under the current system, this is not feasible. Therefore, it is no more plausible than overthrowing the United States government itself. Now, this leads into the second sort of proposal we might hear tonight, that we can overthrow the United States government and then pass a law abolishing private property. Now, the problem here is we're not currently living in revolutionary times, even though the approval rating of Congress is certainly never very good, or even of our president. Even though it's certainly not revolutionary in favor of socialistic or communistic policies, as we're hearing tonight. We must also ask where such revolution would come from, if such a thing could exist at all. Would it come from the military? Would it come from the people itself? I mean, the military seems pretty dubious. I mean, our military is it's fairly right-wing. Given our history with the Soviets, Bolshevism is not going to smell good to high-ranking generals and people within the military establishment. Furthermore, we already know there's a collusion between industry and the military. So, I mean, this raises the question of how the military is going to implement any sort of revolt against the state. Furthermore, any organic revolution from the masses, or as I would prefer calling them, the mob, under mob rule, would have to be directed at the state itself. I mean, anything other than abolishing the state through an organic revolution would just be a quantitative change, not a qualitative change. Remember, we're not saying that we have to decrease the amount of private property, we have to abolish it. So such an organic revolution has to target the state itself. And it doesn't seem that we are actually living these times where this is a plausible option. There are also problems with the transition periods between having private property and having no private property. I mean, obviously this requires a ton of money to do if we're going to establish this new state. I mean, we already know it's extremely expensive to deport every single illegal immigrant. Just imagine how expensive it's going to be enforcing private transactions and making sure that people aren't using their own possessions or property for a profit. So certainly this is going to be an extremely expensive proposal too, which only decreases the feasibility. Furthermore, there would have to be some sort of central planning or price setting if we had some sort of central authority, which is monitoring this could occur at all. And this leads to the possibility of overthrowing money itself. Now, what I'd like to finish by saying before we go to the rebuttals is that I say that some of these prima facie attempts to abolish private property are simply not feasible and are no more feasible than first overthrowing the United States government. Now, what we see the policies within the current system run into legislative and judicial difficulties, especially when considering federal and state level jurisdictions. And even if we overthrew the government, we still see that there are problems in price setting and enforcing the distinction between private property and personal property, which is by no means obvious what this distinction is, what the Marxists claim it is. And it would have to have constant monitoring to ensure that no one dares to make a profit off of anything they own, even their toothbrush or their car or their apartment or whatever. So in this opening statement, I'm just discussing the broad proposals, and I hope to hear from the socialistic side some of the more convoluted and intricate plans.
Okay, thank you, Mathoma. You now have 5 minutes to give a rebuttal of Snake's opening statement.
All right. Well, first, I'm a little confused as to why
Hold
Mathoma.
on. No, it's Mathoma goes first with the rebuttal.
Oh, my apologies. Go ahead.
Mathoma, you get to go. You get your 5 minutes to rebut Miss SnakeIsNinja.
Okay. Yeah, as I was saying, there seems to be a rather tenuous distinction between personal and private property here. Now, as I said, this is a distinction that's freely made within Marxist circles, but it does not seem clear to me what in the world this distinction is supposed to be. I recall that private property is supposed to be that which is owned by the individual, not a state entity, and which is going to be used for others to work on and for the person who owns it to extract some sort of profit from it. Now, personal property is supposed to be basically this minus the profit stuff, minus getting other people to work on this. Now, the distinction does not seem clear because certain things have within them the possibility of being used by other people, just within their very own nature. For example, the thing that Snake brought up of growing tomatoes, of course, gardens have within them the intrinsic possibility of being, of having the owner employ other people to work on the garden, perhaps expand the garden to something bigger, have more plants come onto it, pay others for planting, for harvesting, going to sell in the market. And all of these, of course, incur some sort of profit within them. So even within this garden example, we've already collapsed the distinction between personal possessions and private property. One thing I'd like to note that I think we agree on, SnakeIsNinja and I, that these proposals seem to be, have as their necessary condition for abolishing private property is necessary to abolish the state. At least do that. Or to radically transform the state, because under our current system, private property rights are currently enforced. So the state would have to be overthrown by something. I mean, I'm not sure within, we've actually heard a mechanism thus far within Snake's proposal of how such a overthrow of the state is going to happen. He cites approval ratings. I mean, certainly this is true that certain parts of our government are not really popular. Certainly the Congress is never very popular. The presidency is usually not very popular as well. But how exactly is this going to take place? I mean, people can just be pissed off all day, but what is the mechanism by which this is going to occur? I mean, as I said before, we can have these organic little movements forming, such as those that occurred in the 1960s. But these, again, these are quantitative changes. What the debate resolution tonight is a qualitative change. We need a complete overthrow of the system. We need a total abolition of private property, not merely a decrease in private property or just a bunch of ragtags complaining about such and such being too rich or having too much private property or George Soros or whatever. Now, it's certainly true that few people own private property. Even if I did concede that point, that a few people own private property, perhaps I don't even own private property. I mean, this seems to have nothing to do with the debate resolution of how we're going to actually abolish private property for these, especially rich people. It seems to make the situation more difficult for his position, because if these people indeed are so wealthy, I mean, we already know that people like George Soros, oil companies, they already, they pull a lot of the strings behind the scenes in the government. I mean, why in the world would someone like George Soros or an oil company, would it just be for fun to say, okay, we're now going to abolish private property? I mean, even if we conceded that they have all the power, I mean, what is their motive for abolishing private property? Did they somehow pick up Lenin, some treatise of Lenin, and say, okay, I'm suddenly convinced on Bolshevism, let's do this just for fun? One thing that I think is lacking from the affirmative side in this debate is an actual mechanism for how this is going to actually happen. How are we going to get from this state that we're in now, which currently has private property? I mean, we can debate the extent to which we have private property. How are we going to get to this state, to a different state in which private property is totally abolished? As I repeatedly say, this is not merely a quantitative change. It's not merely a decrease in the amount of private property, but it's a qualitative change. We have to totally abolish private property. It's something of a different kind. It's not merely a decrease or increase in private property. And I think that's what I'd like to conclude with. I look forward to hearing some of the more convoluted proposals, as I said, to how we're going to actually get from this qualitative change from having private property, which is what we have now, to having no private property. That's all I have.
Okay, so Snake, your 5 minutes of rebuttal begins now.
All right. Well, Mathoma, you said a lot right there. You spoke a lot about hierarchies and systems, but in my opinion, you failed to demonstrate why the abolition of private property is not feasible. That is the topic of the discussion. We are not debating whether the USSR was a nice place to live or if abolishing private property is something that should even be done. The question is the abolition of private property feasible? And it is. Now, Mathoma even gave examples of how we might do this. I thank you for that. Like you said, we could pass a law top down. And he seemed to suggest that such a thing is beyond the realm of possibility, ignoring the various historical examples of states which have done exactly that successfully. Furthermore, Mathoma presumed that we are talking about the United States, which was not explicitly within the topic of the debate, but let's assume that we are talking about the United States. You also assume that the law would have to be constitutional to pass, which I find comical, quite frankly. I couldn't count on both of my hands, on both of my fingers, the number of blatantly unconstitutional laws which have successfully passed in the federal government. Now, as for overthrowing the government, which he alluded to, if you think that a civil war or a revolution of some sort could not occur in this day and age, then you are either naive, not paying attention to the news, or simply unaware of the enormous divide and tensions forming amongst the residents of this country, and the availability of firearms in just the southern portion of the United States alone. I want to give you a theoretical scenario. Let's say a radical left-wing administration is elected, say, 10 years from now, for example, who passes anti-hate speech laws and attempts to arrest people who express controversial opinions. Do you really think that people would stand for that? Anyone with even remotely right-wing views would consider this tyranny of the most radical sort and would probably trigger a rebellion of some kind. Furthermore, the average soldier in the US military is certainly going to have strong right-wing views and would regard freedom of speech as a vital thing. In such a conflict, the military would probably be on the side of the rebels and not the state. And thus, I would say that it is definitely feasible that such a revolution could occur and would be successful at toppling the state. Now, to pick up where I left off earlier, I was talking about different ways that this could be done. And I mentioned state-down action, which has happened in many cases in the Soviet Union, which has happened with the Tsar and the French monarchy. There are other ways. Like you said, there could be a violent revolution, some sort of direct action. That's pretty self-explanatory, but there could also be a peaceful revolt, like, for example, a massive strike or a walk-in protest. I want you to imagine what would happen if, say, 3% of the people in the United States one day decided to go on strike. That's over 10 million people. What is the state going to do? Arrest them all? 10 million people? What if they resist arrest? Do you really think that the police are prepared to open fire into crowds of millions of nonviolent protesters, these people being their neighbors because the state told them to? 10 million people. Do you think they're prepared to do this? Furthermore, if the army refuses to enforce the will of the state because they deem it too reprehensible, then the state is effectively defanged and powerless to enforce anything on anyone. Now, history is no stranger to revolution. This is precisely what happened to the Shah of Iran and in Russia, first in the Revolution of 91, which was a peaceful revolution, and in the bloody Revolution of 17. All it takes to topple an empire is for the people to lose faith in it. And I would say the faith in the United States federal government is pretty darn low right now. If private property is not enforced, it is good as abolished. And I think it is feasible that private property could be abolished. And that's all I have to say about that for the time being.
Okay. Snake, your 10 minutes of cross-examining Mathoma begins now.
All right, thank you. I guess I would start on some of the points that I brought up before. Again, why do you think that overthrowing the government is not something that is possible?
Well, certainly I would concede that is possible, but remember we're discussing whether such a thing is feasible. Where I see your position lacking is that there are no potential means for overthrowing the United States government at this time. I mean, certainly as we both agree that there are certain elements of the United States government which are not very popular. But here we're not talking about unpopularity in general. We're talking about something very specific, which is the abolition of private property. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that there are any such revolutionary idea at this time.
Again, I think what you're missing here is that if the state collapses, there is no entity which can enforce private property. So it doesn't matter what the reasoning or the philosophy of the rebels is. If there is a successful revolt, then private property is effectively meaningless.
Well, sure, but the antecedent there, if the revolution occurs, this is something I haven't heard from your side. Like, why would the revolution occur in the first place, and why would it be on the side of some communistic policy, which the United States has experience with? As I said, we have a sort of we Americans have a nose for sniffing out Soviet policies. I mean, something like this is not, at the moment, very plausible right now.
Yes.
I mean, there's no radical sentiment to overthrow the government right now. Would you say?
I find that laughable, but I did go into great detail about a circumstance that could happen, for example, within the next decade, in which a left-wing administration got into power and, in the name of progressivism, tried to pass anti-hate speech legislation. I don't think that's not a feasible thing at all. I think that's very likely.
Well, sure. Even if I totally conceded that you would just replace one state with another, what makes you think that the new state would have to would abolish these private property laws? Why wouldn't they just pick up some of the spirit of America that we have now, which is the maintenance of private property? Why would this new administration have any sort of? Go ahead.
We're getting into the topic of, once this revolution occurs, what would happen in the aftermath? What state or lack of a state would be established, and what would their philosophies be? None of this is part of the topic of discussion, which is it feasible that private property could be abolished? And it would if there was a violent revolution that overthrew the state. It would be feasible.
Well, why do you say it would be feasible if it's only but transitory? I mean, you're saying you're going to pin me on something like the state is gone for like 5 minutes and then a new state comes about, and then therefore private property abolition is feasible?
During the time after which the state has been abolished, there would be no state to enforce private property. During this time period, private property would be effectively abolished. And you could say it's possible that another state will at some point replace the previous one, but I don't know when this would occur, how it would occur, what the state would look like. I mean, we're assuming all kinds of things. All I know is that it is feasible that we would enter a time period in which private property is unenforceable.
Did you have another question?
Yes. I was talking about some peaceful possibilities that this might occur in. I was wondering, I mean, do you really think that if the United States military was ordered to, try to arrest 10 million people or something, do you really think that they would comply with this?
What's the alternative?
Do you think that police officers would be willing to arrest their neighbors just for going on strike? I see that as ridiculous.
Police officers arrest people all the time. I mean, it's certainly
10 million people.
Well, it makes you think we're currently
where
living
would we
in
put them?
What makes you think that we're living in a state right now where there's currently 10 million people latently waiting for some sort of revolution to occur?
Again,
I mean, this is the perennial hope of Marxists, that there's some sort of revolution.
Right. I do find it just very interesting that you don't think that we are in a time period of tumultuous division between the people in this country that if I mean earlier today, didn't we get a tweet from Trump that he's basically declaring war on North Korea? What if North Korea fires a nuke and it hits California? Do you not think that there would be some kind of violence in the aftermath of such an event?
Well, certainly there would be violence. I mean, politics is a very tumultuous thing. But I mean, what makes you think that the mass of 10 million is going to become organized and want to overthrow the government itself, as opposed to just being total chaos?
They don't even have to be organized. If 10 million people just started rioting, which I do not think is beyond the realm of possibility, any cops that go in to try to maintain law and order, do you think these people are really going to just comply in such a maddened state after a nuclear missile hit the United States? I find that very hard to believe.
Well, I mean, what's the alternative? The mutiny?
I mean, this is something that's possible. And again, if the state cannot enforce its laws, if the state cannot, maintain order, then whether or not there's a state, it effectively doesn't matter. The state cannot enforce the various things like private property that it would normally enforce during a period of order.
Well, that's certainly true, but I disagree on the point that we're saying that a transitory chaos within the state is tantamount to making it feasible to abolish private property in the long term. I mean, certainly if a plan only works for like 5 seconds, if the plan only works in the short term, why would you say that is feasible if we're just going to revert back to something which is already in accordance?
Now, I'm willing to concede that it's possible that it would not be sustainable. I don't know that it's impossible that a libertarian sort of stateless society couldn't be sustainable, but that's not the discussion of conversation. The discussion is it feasible? You inserted the words, is it something that could be sustainable in the long term? That's not part of the topic of discussion.
Would you say that something's not feasible in the long term is feasible? I mean, again, if you have a policy which can only work for like, a couple of months, would you say that such a thing is feasible?
Why do you think it would only be feasible for a couple months? And yes, if it's feasible, it's feasible. I mean, that it is what it is.
Well, I disagree. I have higher standards on what a policy would look like. I mean, certainly we all agree that politics is a tumultuous place. I have certain disagreements on what a feasible plan of action would look like to abolish private property. I mean, you're just proposing that we have chaos.
I'm not proposing that we have chaos. I'm saying it's very likely, and if it was to occur, it would be impossible to enforce private property, and it would be effectively abolished.
Well, again, I mean, we're just circling around the same issue of whether feasible, as I see it, is a long-term sustained program which moves us from the state of having private property now in the long term and effectively to a state of not having private property, such as the dream of Marxists and socialists. I mean, certainly Marx wouldn't have said that such a thing should be implemented if it could only be sustained for like 1 month or something. I mean, the Marxist socialists, they want a long-term solution. They want a long-term abolition of private property.
However, that issue is not the topic of debate. I don't have to agree with everything that Karl Marx ever said. I am proposing something, and I think it is feasible. I still don't see that you've demonstrated that it isn't. And I mean, I'm just trying to think, why do you think, let me concede that it should be something that's feasible in the long term. Even if I was to do that, why do you think it is not feasible in the long term that after this post-state period, that there would suddenly be a new state which would control the entire, continental United States under one government? I don't see any reason why that would happen overnight.
Well, don't we have a historical example of roughly what you just said? I mean, we see how sustainable the Soviet Union was. That project collapsed after 60 years? Not even 60 years?
60 years is a long time, and I think that
even
a 60-year policy is feasible.
And certainly the Soviets did not completely abolish private property. They had to eventually become something of a capitalist state. In the end, they had to reinstate private property rights just to keep the thing afloat for a few more years.
Mathoma, you're dodging the point here, which is you said if it's feasible, it has to be feasible over time. Is 60 years not long enough for it to be feasible?
Your 10 minutes is up, Snake.
Thank you.
Okay, Mathoma, your 10 minutes of cross-examination begins now.
Yeah, how do you distinguish between private property and personal possessions?
Well, again, I mean, I can read the common definition that pretty much everyone agrees on. I mean, you can look this up, but what I would say is that what personal property is, to try to put it in a way that is simple for everyone to understand, would be property from which the owner does not derive a profit, or that the owner does not, personal property that the owner operates himself.
That the owner just operates himself?
Right.
So that's even in your garden example, that would be personal possession.
Correct. Personal property, yes.
Okay, suppose you had like a car or something, which you could conceivably, I mean, it's within the nature of cars and driving them and such that you could hire other people to, you could cart other people around, you could set up a taxi service, you can employ people to drive the car for you. I mean, would you not concede that this is in the category of personal possession?
I would say that if you are hiring someone, you're paying them to drive your car, then at that point, first of all, you're making a profit off of it. This is very different than if you were to like lend your car to your friend, you can drive this somewhere. You're making a profit off of it and someone else is operating it. So I think, if you had this taxi cab driving service with, a fleet of taxis going around a city at that point, yeah, it would be a private property.
And how do you propose to maintain this illegality of using things for profit? When we can see clearly in this example of cars, even in your garden example, that certain things within their own nature can easily be used for making money or having others work on them.
Could you rephrase that question? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
How do you propose on actually enforcing people not making money off of certain things like cars and gardens?
Well, first of all, you presume that we would have to enforce this, or it would have to be enforced. Whereas again, if the state is either overthrown, or if the state is unable to enforce private property norms, then you don't have to enforce it. I mean, anyone could just make off with the car and now it's his property. What are you going to do? There's no way to enforce private property without some kind of mechanism.
You seem to be confusing the issues between enforcing the rights of private property and there actually being private property.
Again, I talked a lot about how there are abstract principles of ownership, but if these principles are not actually observed in reality, then it's not effectively something that matters.
Well, I mean, that's simply a tautology to say that it doesn't effectively matter. I mean, you're just saying what is observed in practice is observed in practice. I mean, do you not distinguish between the abstract rights of people to have the abstract existence of private property?
I mean, are we
the right of enforcement?
Are we debating whether it is possible to abolish an idea? I mean, I assume we're debating whether it's possible to abolish it in reality, in practice.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the enforcement of something, the right of something is a different issue from whether it is actually there. But again, you don't recognize that property exists on its own and has its own nature too. Like I said in the car, it's not some sort of miracle of nature that cars can be used for certain things like employing people to drive them and carrying people around as in a taxi service. I mean, this exists whether there's a state or not. I mean, these potentials of the car certainly exist whether there's a state or not. How are you going to get rid of that?
Yes, but first of all, we're not talking about potentials. We're talking about reality. And second of all, you're saying, do I acknowledge that, these things exist sort of just in the ether, like a soul or something, like just The fact that you own this private property is just something which is objectively true, and it is ethereal. I mean, this is just getting very philosophical, and it doesn't really connect to reality again.
Well, of course it connects to reality, because cars can be used for things such as driving people around. I mean, this isn't some ethereal thing that I'm proposing. I'm just saying that it could potentially be used for such a thing. So there has to be some sort of way of disentangling the use as personal possession, which is what you're hoping for, and as private property.
Look,
I mean, how are you maintaining this?
Yes. When a state says, you have the right to property or you have the right to life, what they're saying is that we will, enforce, we will protect you. If someone murders you, that this is illegal. It's not just talking about philosophy. It's also talking about application. And the fact that you are just divorcing it from any application seems very naive to me.
Well, certainly we're also talking about the objective existence of private property and not merely the right to have private property. I mean, again, in practice, how do you prevent people like, say, you or me? If we have a car, how do you prevent someone like me from paying someone to cart people around, employing people and doing all sorts of things that capitalists typically do?
If you are not operating this property, right? So someone is driving your taxi around and you are deriving a profit from it. I mean, why do you assume that this person will, not potentially make off with your taxi? And if they do, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to assert your ownership of this private property without anything to appeal to?
Well, I mean, certainly we're not debating upon whether people can steal things. But I mean, in a stable society, people are going to use certain things, going to employ other people. Why are they going to employ other people? Because they want more money. Why do they want more money? Well, because people are people by their nature. How do you prevent people from doing such a thing without having some sort of massive police state?
I feel like we are talking past each other because, again, you have no method by which you can enforce your private property rights. Conceivably, you might have a high trust society in which people don't typically steal from each other, but the moment a single conflict of interest occurs, there is no method to arbitrate who owns what. It's just, you can yell from the Alps that I own X private property, but if there is no one to enforce this, then I'm sorry, buddy, but you really don't.
But how do you prevent such relations from reforming? As I was saying before, to be feasible, it has to be successful in the long term, not merely as some transitory state.
This is a definition you have added.
And say that something is feasible, you want to implement some feasible policy. If it only works for like a couple months.
We're not talking about if we want to do it. We're talking about if it's feasible.
If it is feasible, yeah. If it's feasible to have some situation, I guess your side was proposing that we have some situation in which private property is totally abolished and the relations that the Marxists don't like don't become reestablished immediately. And this is sort of what I'm getting at with the car example, that these social relations are going to be reestablished almost immediately by the very nature of cars and of money. And you don't really have anything to enforce this. So
for 60 years, again, I'm going back to that, for 60 years in the Soviet Union, these relations were gone, but you seem to think that a 60-year period is not enough for something to be feasible. I mean, how long does it have to be 10,000 years? I mean, how long has the United States of America existed as a government? Is it not feasible that this is a government just because it doesn't meet your arbitrary amount of time?
Well, I mean, I'll leave it to the audience to see whether such examples such as the Soviet Union are feasible options or...
there are communist countries that are going on today. I mean, several. It's just, I don't understand what about this isn't feasible if it's happening right now.
But you think the Soviet Union is a genuine example of a feasible option which maintains the lack of private property? Because you and I both know that they had to reestablish some measure of private property.
If they maintained it for 60 years, I would say it is feasible.
Well, I mean, the thing collapsed immediately.
Immediately?
It collapsed pretty suddenly, did it not?
Ah, I see.
I mean,
Suddenly. I thought you meant
if we have an actual example of something where we know it collapsed, why would you say that this mode of action is feasible?
Because we have examples of pretty much every system, monarchies, republics, democracies, collapsing. That doesn't mean that they're not feasible systems. They are certainly feasible systems.
So you meant this is doomed to failure? That if you implement something that's just Bolshevistic, that's doomed to failure?
I did not admit that, but I mean, tell me one nation that has never failed. You know, it was established 10,000 years ago, and it's still. Go ahead.
Your cross-examination is over, Mathoma. Your 5-minute closing statement begins now, Mathoma.
Right. So I think we were getting a little bit caught up in this terminological squabble between what is feasible and not feasible. I mean, certainly I'll leave it to the audience to decide what feasible means. I mean, if we have concrete examples of systems which come about through some means, and through their own internal workings, they eventually come to failure, why would we say that it is feasible to implement the option that initiated this whole process in the first place? I mean, to suggest that we should repeat these sorts of things is not really to say that these things are feasible. It's simply to say that they're a ticking time bomb. In the case of the Soviet Union, all we're saying is that such a thing can be done for 60 years and then it's doomed to failure. Such a policy that's reminiscent of the Soviet Union, it can be implemented for maybe 60 years, but we kind of know, like I said, it's a ticking time bomb. It's doomed to failure. It's doomed to blow up. So that was really the main terminological squabble I think we've been getting at tonight. But I mean, the only sort of situation I've heard from Snake is that perhaps there is some organic rebellion brewing beneath the surface in this country that's going to seek to overthrow the entire government. Now, certainly, I'm not sure if we have sufficient evidence to think that such a disagreement, an internal conflict, is enough to overthrow the government itself. I mean, certainly we have internal conflicts all the time. I mean, this is just a story of politics that there are internal conflicts within the country. What makes us think this is going to overthrow the state itself? I mean, even that would have to be accomplished in our proposals to abolish private property, the total abolition of the state. And I go back to the point that I was trying to get Snake to disentangle, which is this distinction that only Marxists seem to make between private property and personal possessions. Now, I claim that such relations they're pretty much doomed to repeat themselves by the very nature of the things under question. I come back to the car example. I mean, just by the internal nature of cars and of people and of monetary relations, that people are going to want to pay each other for doing things like carting people around and employing people in like a taxi service. Or in Snake's example of the garden, they're going to want to employ other people. They're going to want to trade with each other. I mean, it doesn't seem that in any of these chaotic examples that Snake is proposing, that such relations are not going to eventually reform. I mean, like I said, if we have even like a 10-year period where such relations are abolished, I mean, this thing is going to reform organically because of the very nature of the things under question. And Marxists seem to, they want not merely a 10-year plan or even a 60-year plan. They seem to think that their solution is the final one. It is going to be the ultimate sustainable solution where private property is totally abolished and there's not going to be any sort of reformation of the capitalistic relations. Now, I simply deny this is the case, and we have examples of where communist societies, they either have to recognize that these capitalistic relations are not at all arbitrary, as Marxists seem to think, but they reform organically, and they have to encourage these just to keep their own systems afloat. So, I mean, in closing, it seems that we haven't really heard any viable ways other than chaos that we can have a feasible abolition, sustainable abolition of private property. That's all I have to say.
All right, Snake, your 5-minute closing statement begins now.
Thank you. I would like to touch upon again what we were talking about before, which was the USSR, which, as Mathoma said, lasted about 60 years. And he saw this as a 60-year period of time was not convincing to him that abolishing private property was a feasible notion. Now, he also mentioned that if a state, I think he said, a system was doomed to failure, then that is enough to, necessitate that it is not feasible. Now, again, show me one state that did not eventually fail, some system that did not eventually collapse after hundreds of years. I mean, let's talk about the Roman Empire. Well, that lasted about 500 years from what I understand. I mean, I would say 500 years is a pretty good track record. Now, it did collapse eventually, but does that mean that the system of Rome was not feasible, or something that could not occur or be sustained because eventually it collapsed? I completely reject that notion. Again, every system, every state has a half-life, I suppose. I mean, nothing lasts forever. That doesn't mean that something which lasts for almost 100 years is not feasible just because he decides that this is somehow, for some arbitrary reason, not enough. Now, Mathoma also touched upon some of his conflicts with the definitions of personal property and private property. Look, the definitions are what they are. They are clear. They're agreed upon in political philosophy. I mean, if you can't agree on the terms and what they mean, the terms of personal property and private property, I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm not going to debate what words mean. All I can do is talk about whether it's feasible or not to abolish private property. And I guess finally what I would say is Mathoma constantly brings up Karl Marx and Marxist thought, but again, that is not the topic of the debate. I am under no obligation to come to the defense of Marx. I just want to again reiterate that throughout this debate, I fail to see any convincing argument that Mathoma has given to why the abolition of private property is not feasible. I've even demonstrated how several ways in which it might occur, and I think the audience can come to its own conclusion. So yeah, I guess that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. This is the end of the first debate of the Lyceum Debates. This is your host, Todd Lewis, signing off.